In the previous video, we learned how to determine some trigonometry ratios, and now we're going to talk about how we can use those to actually solve some problems. In order to do this, we're going to need our calculator. So if you don't have yours with you right now, pause the video so that you can go grab your calculator. In the first 6 examples, it asks us specifically to use our calculator in order to find each of the trig functions rounded to the nearest hundredth. So this is a pretty simple matter once you have your calculator. I'm going to go ahead and dig mine out. In order to find the sine of 42 degrees, I'm going to go and open up a new document. I'm going to add a calculator. And the very first thing I'm going to do in this document is I'm going to check my settings. I'm going to make sure that my settings are set to determine an angle whose measure is in degrees. Now my display digits are float 12. That means it will display up to 12 digits on the calculator. As far as the choices for angles, you can either have radians, degrees, or gradians. We want to make sure our calculator is always set to degrees. So I'm going to make that the default on my calculator, and you're going to want to do that too. Hit OK. And now, in order to determine the sine of 42 degrees, I'm going to come over here on the left-hand side of my calculator where I see that trig button. And when I hit that, it'll bring up this menu with all the different trig functions. In fact, some that we're not concerned with this year. We want to do the sine of 42 degrees. So 42, I'm just going to hit those numbers. And then to get degrees in there, I'm going to come down to the little pi button along the left-hand side of my calculator that you just barely can't see offside my screen. Once I hit that little pi button, it brings up a menu with some options. I want 42 degrees. And then I hit enter, and it'll give me a nice big long ratio as a decimal. I want to round that number to the nearest hundredth, so 0.67. Now rather than flip-flop back and forth between screens, I'm just going to go ahead and punch all of these into the calculator. Why don't you go ahead and write them down in your notes, though, as I'm calculating them in the calculator. To find the cosine of 38 degrees, I'm going to go back to that trig button. This time the function that I want is the cosine function, and I want to plug in or punch in 38, and then my little pi key to get the degrees to come up, 38 degrees. Rounded to the nearest hundredth, that would be 0.79. Go ahead and write that on your paper. The third one, tangent of 88 degrees, I'm just going to punch in here, tangent of 88, and then the degrees key. And once I hit enter, it'll give me that 28, and then all those decimals I want to round to the nearest 100th, so 28.64. Tangent of 76 degrees. So go ahead, round that one to the nearest 100th and write that on your paper. Sine of 15 degrees. Oh, and I hit the wrong button when I hit that. Let me go back and re-enter that. Sine, because that's going to be hard to round to the nearest hundredth. There we go. So go ahead and round that answer to the nearest 100th. And then the cosine of 54 degrees. And then you want to take that number and round it to the nearest 100th. Excellent. I'm going to go back to that page now. Hopefully you have or took advantage of the fact that we found all those and filled those answers all in at the top of the page. Now we're going to get down to some fun stuff. The directions down at the bottom say find x in each of the triangles below. We're going to put together what we did at the top of the page together with what we did in the previous video. So I'm going to take a look at each one of these triangles. I'm going to take a look in particular at each one of the acute angles that I've been given, and I'm going to label the side opposite that angle O. I'm going to label the hypotenuse of my triangle with an H, And I'm going to label the side or the leg adjacent to that acute angle with an A. I've got 3 trig ratios from which to choose. Remember sine, SOHCAHTOA, TOA. Sine is the relationship between the opposite and the hypotenuse. Cosine is the ratio between the leg adjacent and the hypotenuse. Tangent is the relationship between the opposite side and adjacent side. I think the most difficult part of each and every one of these is deciding which trig ratio I'm going to use. And that's why I label the hypotenuse, the opposite side, and the adjacent side in each and every one of these triangles. This particular question deals with the adjacent side and the hypotenuse. If I take a look at that opposite side, I don't know what the opposite side is. I don't want to know what the opposite side is. This question has nothing to do with the opposite side. I need the trig ratio that deals with the adjacent side and the hypotenuse. So the trig ratio that I need to solve this problem is the cosine ratio. So again, just a reminder that cosine is equal to adjacent over hypotenuse. So my angle that I'm taking the cosine of is 37 degrees. So the cosine of 37 degrees is equal to the adjacent side, which is x, over the hypotenuse, which is 14. The easiest way to solve this equation right here is to put that over 1 and then to cross multiply. So if I go in that direction, 1 times x is x. Going in the other direction, I get 14 times the cosine of 37 degrees. So now I'm going to grab my calculator, and I want my calculator now to determine the value of 14 times the cosine of 37 degrees. So let me go grab my calculator. I'm going to do 14 times the cosine of 37 degrees. So my calculator tells me that's 11.1808971407. So now I have to determine exactly how much or how little they want me to round that answer. In the directions, they tell us that they want to express each of one of these answers to the nearest tenth. So my x value, I'm going to use these little squiggly parentheses to represent about. So to the nearest tenth, that's about, or that is 11.2. So the length of that side in the triangle is about 11.2 units long. All right, I'm going to go on and take a look at the second one. The first thing I'm going to do is label my opposite, my adjacent, and my hypotenuse. So hypotenuse is going to be opposite the right angle. The angle, or the acute angle that I'm being given here to work with is that 62 degrees. The side opposite that is x. The side adjacent to that is 63. So in looking for my trig ratios, I need to find the trig ratio that deals with opposite and adjacent. This question doesn't have anything to do with the hypotenuse. So the trig ratio that deals with opposite and adjacent, TOA, tangent. So tangent is the ratio between the opposite and the adjacent. So the tangent of 62 degrees is equal to the opposite side, x, over the adjacent side, 63. Again, I'm going to put that over 1 and then cross multiply. 1 times x is x. In my other direction, I've got 63 times the tangent of 62 degrees. So I'm going to go ahead and once again grab my calculator, and into my calculator, I'm going to type 63 times the tangent of 62 degrees. And like the first example, the directions here say to round this to the nearest tenth. So when rounded to the nearest tenth, I get 118.5. Whoops. And again, I'm going to use those squiggly little parentheses to indicate about. All right, and since I just broke the 10-minute mark, I'm going to skip over that last example. But I do want you to flip up to the top of the next page, and in your own words, tell me what's important about this video. Tell me what are the key ideas. And then see if you can apply what you've learned in that video to solve questions 2 and 3 on the next page.